Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. Believe it or not, we're at episode 72, and we're joined by a three-time guest, Dr. Jack Rasmus. Y'all know him already. I recommend my audience go back and listen to those episodes 30 and 56 on Kiko's Freethinkers Forum on our YouTube channel specifically because people like the videos. Jack's an economist. He's been on a couple of times already. We've discussed the economic cost of war. We're going to go some into his book, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, because I think it's an interesting book in the context of what we're dealing with in today's economy and this so-called Bidenomics. And so I also encourage y'all to go to Dr. Jack Rasmus's blog. I'm going to link all the information into the episode description. And I just think that there's a great series of tools and resources there for you. And this is going to be a little bit loaded at the beginning when we talk about some of the economic stuff, but my audience is accustomed to that because we've had several economists on already. But I just want to say welcome back to the show, and we can't wait to have this conversation with you, and thanks for accepting the invitation.
My pleasure.
And I wanted to also just plug in just a small ad before we start and say that despite all the YouTube suppression, which is prevalent, I actually had to get my YouTube channel taken down for 3 months when I first started the platform, and I was discouraged, and then I restarted again. The topics we talk about on this forum aren't really lighthearted sometimes, so you get a variety of issues that we confront. But despite that variance and all this, I guess, volatility when we talk about the issues, we've been able to reach 92 different countries, all 50 states. And so we have a third of our audience outside of the United States. And so people are following the forum. I really appreciate all the support I get, especially from the YouTube channel. And I just encourage my audience to subscribe to Kiko's Freethinkers Forum for free, especially people in Jack's audiences too, because I think there's a lot of overlap, and there are a lot of people who are interested in economics, and I think that those would be great relationships to form because we really need to support independent media more than ever in these times because we're combating a lot of different media narratives. So again, we want to say welcome back to the show, and I want to open up with the overarching question that I had reading your book, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, and just explain to the audience like what economic perspective are you coming from when you taught economics at St. Mary's, for instance, and how can we decipher what Bidenomics is? Is this just the same neoliberalism that you describe in the book? What exactly is that?
Yeah, well, my perspective is definitely not mainstream economics. I'm critical of mainstream economics. They haven't done a very good job forecasting events and developments. They miss their forecasts all the time. Mainstream economics is, really the Paul Krugman, New York Times kind of view, and just about all the rest that you get reported here in the business media and by government officials. So I'm definitely not mainstream. I'm critical of mainstream. There's another school that's called heterodox economics, which is kind of critical of mainstream, but it's all over the map. There's no systematic understanding of what's going on. I'm definitely not Austrian or that the free market enterprise view. That's this anachronism that still exists, at least in theory, not in the halls of real economy and politics, academia maybe. The Hayek von Mises kind of Milton Friedman stuff. I'm not a monetarist in that sense. I'm not a neo-Keynesian. That's a kind of a hybrid, bastardized version of Keynes. There's a lot in the original Keynes that I think is of great value. Economists that came after him, like Minsky, who's really like a financial Keynesian. But there's a lot of misrepresentation of what Keynes actually said And those that say, oh, the policy of government spending today is Keynesian is wrong. It's not Keynes. Marxist, there's a lot in Marx that I think is relevant. There's some things that I think are outdated. So I don't think you can really plug me into any of these schools. I have criticisms of all of them, although all of them do have some element of value. I look at the whole school of economics. I've been studying and teaching economics for many years, so I've had the opportunity to read just about everything. And in fact, at St. Mary's College, I had a class for 6 years where we just read 3 books. One was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, another was Karl Marx's Capital, and the other was Keynes's General Theory, and then all the transitions between them. So I am versed in depth in all the real great books of economics, but critical of contemporary economics, which a lot of which I believe is economic ideology. It's not economic science. Well, what's ideology? Ideology is a conscious misrepresentation of facts and truth. And there's a lot of that in economics. A lot of these economists are ideologists, meaning they create economic ideas and theories that can be used by capitalists and their political representatives to push their own interests. That's what ideology is. It's a misrepresentation of facts and truth. It's not an outright lie. Ideology is very clever. It manipulates ideas. I've written about this to some extent in the past, how ideas get manipulated and changed in the service of certain interests. That's what ideology is. So I make a distinction in my analysis between economic ideology and what is economic science. These schools of economic thought are a mix of science and ideology, some more so, contemporary mainstream, more ideology. Nonsense ideas like free trade benefits everybody. That's an ideological statement. That's nonsense, right? Or inflation is always the result of too much money chasing too few goods. That's another piece of nonsense. Or we got income inequality because workers are not as productive. They need to get more education and get more productive. Tax cuts always create jobs. These are all ideological statements, and they're all a misrepresentation of reality in order to make those statements, but they serve certain interests, certain class interests. And I guess that's another lodestone for me. I'm very class oriented in my analysis here, whether it's a critique or a presentation of proposals. So bottom line, I don't think you can plug me into any of these things.
Well, I think that's excellent because I kind of got that impression reading the book because you explain the history of these different schools of thought, but you also, I think, kind of shown that you have to have a balance of economic ideas. It can't be just one train of thought, because every situation is going to be different. And I'm reading that just as a novice. Like, I don't hardly know anything about economics. The most I've ever learned about economics is just from the people I've had onto the show. And I think that that's important. I did want to, I want to get your response to this right here. I was telling you off the air, and you are one of the most popular guests on the show, but I had to get your response to this. Supposedly a Biden supporter, got to be a Biden supporter. So the Bidenomics claim to fame is supposed to be the following numbers here. You tell the audience how true these numbers are and what is being fudged in the figures that this person's reading. They say 13.9 million jobs gained, unemployment rate below 4% for the longest stretch in 50 years, a 70-year low in unemployment for women, and then they have to add the identity politics piece at the end here, record lows in unemployment of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Americans with disabilities. Now, what would be your response to those supposed victories by the Biden administration?
Well, first of all, I would say government statistics is a large body of data, right? And what's the statistic? It's a manipulation of the real data. That's what you're getting, right? And of course, depending on the methodology you use to manipulate the real data, you can come up with what you want. You can find in the Bureau of Labor Statistics on jobs, whatever data point that you want to emphasize. Now, what about this unemployment rate of 3.7%? Okay, let's take that one first, right? Let's debunk that one first. That is only for full-time workers, okay? And there are problems with that, and I'll explain it. That's called the U-3 unemployment rate based upon a government current establishment survey. You see, the labor data comes from two surveys. One is called the Current Establishment Survey, which is large corporations send in their data on jobs to the government every month. That's the CES, right? By the way, only 32% are participating, large corporations, in that. So there's a question. I mean, it used to be like 2/3 would participate and send their data in, but they're not sending it in. But these are large establishments, and misses a lot of the small businesses and unemployment and so employment in the small businesses. And as I just said, what they send in, and that number 3.7 is only for full-time workers from that particular survey. And that's a problem because we have a labor force of about 160 million people, and we have over 50 million who aren't full-time anymore. Okay, so that 3.7 does not pick up the 50 million who are not full-time. It just picks up full-time workers. And if you look in the government data, the employment levels of full-time workers are declining. The numbers for part-time and temp workers are rising. But that doesn't pick that up. The U-3 doesn't pick it up. Now you can go to look at the other government survey called the Current Population Survey, and that is the result of the Labor Department surveying, in other words, calling and talking to 50,000 worker households every month. That's a different methodology and a different survey, and it picks up a lot of small businesses. And in that survey, you get a rough estimate of part-time and temporary workers and workers who have dropped out of the labor force. You see, you're not considered unemployed unless you're out of work and you've looked for work in the last 4 weeks. If you haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks, you're not considered unemployed. You've got no job, but you're considered unemployed, right? You drop out of the statistics. And there's other problems with the statistics too. For example, these reports that I said the government, big businesses send to the government, that's only part of the database that's used to estimate employment, unemployment. Another part of it is what's called new business formation. In other words, every month there's a couple 100,000 new businesses that are formed. It's very small, right? Most of them in the U.S. economy. There's a couple 100,000 that go out of business. When times are good, you get more formation. And when times are bad, you get more going out. During COVID, of course, we had a lot more failing than those coming in. In the recovery period, you get a lot more new businesses being formed. And what the government does is it takes an assumption of what is the net new business formation. In other words, the net new businesses formed minus those that are going out of business. And it takes that information and it adds it to the information that the big enterprises are sending to the government. The problem with new net business formation data is that it's lagged 6 to 9 months. They're taking data 6 to 9 months ago and added it to the the monthly amount that the big businesses are sending the government, and they mash it together, right? And the assumption of net business development, there's a certain number of employees they assumed are part of every new business formation. The problem with that, though, is they know how many new businesses are formed, but they don't know how many go out of business. Because when you go out of business, you don't bother telling the government. When you form a business, you got to file. right? So that data, net new business development, 6 to 9 months lag, is very questionable. But they take that and they squash it together with the reports. Only 32% of the companies reporting now, and that's their database. And then they do other methodologies on it, like seasonality adjustment and so forth. And that's the 3.7% they got that they report to you. And they never report the fact that you got unemployed, part-time temp, and dropping out of the labor force people. That's in the other survey, current population survey. That's in the government data, but you never see the media reporting that. If they did, the unemployment rate is not 3.7%, it's 6, 7, 8% still. The other point that you made is, oh, well, there's 13 million jobs created. No, they're not created. These are jobs that disappeared. People didn't go to work during COVID. They had to stay home by order, right? And then they're restored. People start going back to work. So most of that 13.7 is not, it's not a new job created. The job was there and the people just dropped out, and then they come back to work in 2021 and 2022. So that's another ideological misrepresentation. Oh, these were created by Biden. No, they weren't. Very few of these were actually net new jobs. You know, in certain areas, tech, maybe they were, but these are restored jobs, not created jobs. People come back to work. So that would be my debunking of these two often reported statistics of 3.7% unemployment. No, it's really 6 to 8%. And the 13.7 million is not 13.7 million. It's people returning to work, most of them, majority. And there are some that are net new. But the net new is distorted by this questionable new business development statistic that's 6 to 9 months old. So that would be my critique of the data. It's not that they're lying, they're cherry picking the data when they report it to you. They go into this massive Labor Department database, the media and the government and the politicians, to make themselves look good, and they pull out the data that they think makes them look good, but the data's there. I mean, what I'm telling you, my critique is all based upon government data, right? It's not something I'm making up. It's there. But I'm not cherry picking. I'm looking at the whole thing.
If I'm asking a general question, or someone's on the street and they ask you, Dr. Rasmus, what is the overall health of the current economy? What would be your response to that question?
Well, it's chronic inflation. Okay, you know, they're saying, oh, inflation has come down. This is where they pick another data, right? Okay, let's talk about the price data, right? There's 3 measures of inflation in the US. One is called the Consumer Price Index. That's the one that affects us all. Another is called the PCE, Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. Another is called the GDP Deflator Index. Now, the CPI comes closest to measuring what is actually inflation in the US. It lowballs it in some way, but and I'll explain how, but it comes closest. Now, the CPI is the 450 or so main goods and services that we all buy, right? So it's closer to what we actually spend and the prices we actually pay for it, right? Now, that 450 goods and services are weighted. In other words, we spend more of our disposable income on shelter, rents, you know, mortgages and so forth, and on food than we do, you know, buying laptops, you know, or pencils or paper clips or whatever, right? You know, we very seldom spend things on that. So they get a bigger weight, you know, maybe shelter is 40% of that consumer price, and I forget what the exact, you know, percentage is right now, and that's closest. But there's some problems with that. For example, let's take rents, which has been a big problem in the inflation index. Rents is a service. right? The index is made up of goods, in other words, discrete things you buy, and services that you go and pay for, right? Be they medical services or transportation services or services for utilities, right? Energy and so forth, or personal services or entertainment services and government services, financial services, right? Services is 80% of the economy. The goods, discrete things you buy, cars and clothes and so forth, that's 20% of GDP and the economy. So services in the US is the big bulk of the consumer price index, right? So in the CPI, if you look at it right now, services inflation has not come down very much. 15 months ago, in the summer of 2022, we had a 9% CPI index, 9%, right? It's come down to what? Oh, they're saying it's come down to about 4%, or even lower than that, they're saying, in using another index, the PCE. You see, the PCE is not based on the 450 goods we buy most often. It's based on the millions of goods and services that exist in the economy, which they just estimate. The CPI, the Labor Department actually does surveys. It sends people out to the stores. It calls people every month, 50,000. It says, well, what did you pay for this? What did you pay for that? It's a true survey. The PCE is not a true survey. The PCE is a lot of assumptions about what's going on in terms of prices, and it lowballs. The PCE is always much lower, but that's the one again that they report in the media, just like they like to report the U-3 full employment number, right? But if you use the CPI, you come up with a different inflation that's higher. And the problem in the last year is that even though the total goods and services in the PCI has come down from 9 to about 4, right? The services, the majority of the economy, is still stuck at about 6%. It hasn't come down, even though the interest rates have had a record run up, right? It's chronically stuck at about 6% for the last 4 or 5 months. In other words, Fed interest rates of 5.5% cannot bring the services inflation index down below 5 to 6%. Now, the goods index has come down. The interest rate hikes have brought it down. So has the slowing of the global economy. Goods prices, for whatever you're buying, discrete things, could be gasoline, could be cars, right? Could be appliances, whatever, that has come down to about 0. So the total decline from 9% to about 4% has been almost totally due to goods prices coming down in the last year. Service prices, most of what we pay for, are chronically stuck. Now, the addendum to that is that the goods prices are going up again. The service prices aren't coming down anymore, but the goods prices are going up, particularly energy, gasoline, fuel oil, natural gas. Watch this winter, you're going to get hit for national gas, our fuel oil prices. That's coming. There's going to be a big run up in fuel oil prices. Insurances are going up. That's another component of the services price thing going up. That's continuing to go up. Medical insurances, watch it. Auto insurance is already up. Auto repairs are already up, and rents are way up. Okay, rents and shelter, the biggest part of recent inflation has been rents. And the government a year ago said, oh, well, rents are going to come down. Well, they haven't come down. They're chronically high. You got price gouging going on. If you look, let me back up. If you look at inflation over this period from opening up of the economy to present, what you see is initially you had supply problems, chronic supply chain problems, which kept goods prices up, right? As they resolve some of those supply chain problems, good prices have come down. But that was a big cause in 2021. Goods prices were up, right? Another element of that was corporate price gouging. As the economy opened in 21-22, corporations that lost money because of the shutdown were trying to recoup their money and their revenue, and they raised prices dramatically in 21-22. So you got supply chain problems and you got price gouging problems. You still got price gouging problems. For example, in meat processing and bakery goods, which did not shut down during COVID, they kept those factories open, right? They didn't have any shortages, whatever. They were price gouging people big time coming out of the whole process. The airlines were price gouging people. The railroads are price gouging people. So price gouging is an important element of this run up in inflation. Now that's all supply side problems, right? Demand side is about people, trying to increase their purchase of things. And as we came out of the economy, people got restored their jobs, came back, things they couldn't do in services, for example, they started doing again, right? So you had some demand driving up prices. Prices inflation is supply and demand, right? If you constrict supply, if you have a supply problem and a shortage, prices go up. If you increase the demand for goods, prices also go up. Initially, it was supply problems. Then you had demand laid on top of that. The supply problems for goods abated some, but you still had demand, but you had corporate price gouging going on. Now, demand is driven by your wage income. And if you get jobs again, your wage income goes up, right? By your savings that you may have. People had some savings because of COVID, but that's been gone since 2022. That's not a cause of demand inflation right now. Wages are skewed to the top, meaning the top 10% of the highest paid workers are getting the wage increases, and you got some minimal wage increases coming at the bottom end, but in the big middle, wages are not rising. So wages are not driving demand inflation. Credit cards are playing a role, though. People are maxed out on their credit cards. They're using credit cards to pay their rent and their mortgages. So we have this huge run up in credit cards, right? And now people are just getting hit with the student loans, 43 million of them, that they're going to have to spend on that. So they're going to spend less on everything else. So it's not demand inflation. We still have a problem with price gouging going on. We still have supply chain problems here and there that are keeping it high. And other problems that exist, like the sanctions policy of the U.S. government, which has driven global prices for crude oil and other commodities, industrial commodities, metals, and so forth, and agriculture commodities up. The sanctions have played a role by the government worldwide as well in driving up prices here at home, particularly the oil price, crude oil price, which is $90 a barrel about right now. And that gets translated into gasoline prices, which we all know are going up. In the last couple of months, gas prices have played a lot. Rents have played a big role. Actually, rents were like 40% of the recent CPI increase in the last couple of months. It's the big factor here. And that's just gouging by landlords. It's not as if you have more people demanding rents. It's just the landlords see an opportunity when you eliminated the rent controls here during COVID to see an opportunity to just jack up their prices. And to some extent, when you have house prices go up, rents go up as well. But the rent inflation is even higher than what they're saying. I'll tell you why. Here's another questionable thing about the government statistics. There are about 110 million housing units in this country. About half of them are people owning homes, right? About 50 million. About another 50 million or so are people who are actually true renters, right? When you talk about rent increase, you're talking about that 50 so a million. But the government, get this, not only looks at the inflation for actual true renters, right? It looks at homeowners and it says homeowners pay themselves rent. It's called owner's equivalent rent, right? So homeowners are paying themselves rent, which is nonsense, right? And the government takes that owner's equivalent rent and adds it to the actual rent increases for true renters, increases the denominator for the rent price increase, in other words, cuts it in half almost, and says that, oh, that's the rent increase, right? It smooths out and lowers the actual true rent increases. And even so, you get rents huge contribution to the CPI here. Now, the third index, just quickly, is the GDP deflator price index. We talked about the first two, CPI and how it's more accurate, not perfectly. There are problems like owner's equivalent rent. Another problem with the CPI, before I go on to the other, is that, for example, it's called hedonic pricing. What the hell is that? Hedonic pricing. Well, the government, Labor Department statisticians say that if a product has increased in its quality, offers more features and services, you have to subtract that quality increase from the actual price you're paying. So that we get, let's take an example, iPhones, cell phones, rising by hundreds of dollars every year, but actually in the price index, the CPI, they assume that the cost of an iPhone declines because the quality, the features have been increased. So what you pay is actually more for an iPhone, but the government says, no, you got a price cut, and it averages that out. The same thing with cars, right? The cost of new cars number is lowered by saying, oh, we've got all these sensors in the new cars and everything, right? That's a quality increase. Therefore, the 10% increase in a new car is really only 3%. Those are all kind of problems that are, dug into the CPI index. But even so, the CPI is better than the PCE for reasons I said. And then the GDP deflator, the one that they use to estimate economic growth, real growth, is even less, is even lower than the PCE and the CPI in measuring inflation. Now, what that does is say it boosts the GDP economic growth numbers every quarter and every year, because what you get GDP economic growth is adjusted for inflation, right? Nominal inflation includes all the prices plus the number of goods, new goods that have been sold, right? So if your inflation number is lower than actual CPI, then your real GDP is going to be reported higher. If you use the CPI as the adjustment inflation for economic growth and real GDP, there would be no growth. We would be negative. We would be in recession right now. And of course, we are in a goods recession. Manufacturing in this country has contracted 10 months in a row. All the leading economic indicators indicate recession. Right? There are other indicators that indicate the goods part of the economy, 20% of the economy, is in recession, as well as globally, manufacturing is in recession. Right? The only thing keeping it up is the services, 80% of the economy, where we have this chronic inflation problem. Right? Okay, so that's all I got to say, long-windedly perhaps, about these indexes. But it's important to understand how the government measures inflation and measures employment and unemployment. Bottom line, it cherry picks the lowest numbers that it can find to report in the media. The actual inflation and the actual unemployment is much, much higher. Bottom line, true inflation is probably 6 to 8%, and true unemployment for everybody, when you count missing labor force and discouraged and those who have dropped out and so forth, and the part-time and so forth, is really not 3.7. It's probably somewhere between 6 and 8% as well. Now, One final comment about this. This is the true picture. It's a very weak growth and a very chronic inflation coming out of the most massive fiscal and monetary stimulus in the history of this country. During 2021 and part of 22, the government spent $4 to $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus spending. On top of that, in addition to that, the Federal Reserve threw $5 trillion at the banks and investors. So you have somewhere between $6 and $9 trillion of fiscal monetary stimulus thrown into the economy. And what did we get in terms of real growth? Mm-hmm. Look at the government statistics again, at the Commerce Department GDP numbers, right? What do you see from the December 31st of 2021 to December 31st of 2022? One full year, the first full year after the COVID spending had been eliminated, right? What do you see in GDP growth after $8 trillion of fiscal monetary stimulus? You see a 1% of real GDP growth from December to December, 1% for a massive stimulus. What that means is fiscal monetary policy is not working. It's inefficient. It's not working as it used to work to stimulate the economy, just as it's not working as it used to work to bring down inflation. That is, one of the main points that I make when I talk about neoliberalism and Bidenomics and what's happening today in the U.S. economy. Keep that in mind, right? We've got very slow chronic growth despite massive stimulus that's occurred. And now that stimulus is being diverted into subsidizing big corporations and subsidizing their revenue and their profit.
Based on the premise of your book, we've had these distinct periods in history. We're talking about roughly, because you ended at the Trump administration, because at the time he was in office, you started like the early 1900s and you broke down these restructuring periods of neoliberalism. And from what I got from the book, is basically a repackaged word for imperialism, like the way that screams imperialism if you spread this across the world and apply these same types of ideas and practices alongside. I'm thinking about the statistic towards the beginning of the book that you read, and I'm going to give the 4 bullet points that I picked up from that and sort of make a possible comparison to the future to see if the premise of your book is saying that this is just going to be a restructuring like decades after decades, then we can basically foresee the same types of catastrophes reoccurring. I mean, I guess if you read that enough, because you've seen it throughout history, but just you take the 08-09 collapse, for instance, $4 trillion in pension values lost, 20 million workers went without jobs, 14 million families' mortgages were foreclosed, $5 trillion to $10 trillion in cash given to these companies and subsidized loans at 0% interest in a lot of these cases, or near 0% interest. How do we compare that to the COVID era? Because you mentioned the trillions that the government was involved with then. So how do you compare those two periods? And what does that say within the next decade, for instance? Is this just setting up for another vicious cycle?
Okay. In the book, I try to explain that the current era, E-R-A, is what we call neoliberalism, right? Bidenomics is just the extension of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was a restructuring of the economy in the late 70s, early 80s that continued for decades and still is with us in response to the crisis, economic crisis of the US and global capitalist economies in the 1970s, right? If you step back and you look at economic history, in the U.S. economic history in particular, you see the capitalists have gone through a restructuring of the economy on several occasions. When there is a crisis, they restructure, or when there is a great opportunity and a crisis, they restructure. What do we mean by restructuring, right? What we mean is in part at least, coming up with a set of policies, economic policies, that allow American U.S. capitalists to either recover their power in a crisis or expand their power when the opportunity arises. The first restructuring occurs right after World War I. This is an opportunity for American capitalists to become a global power, along with the British, right? The British Empire. World War I devastated, really undercut the British Empire, the cost of wars. And the U.S. took the opportunity to step forward and become a imperial power along with the British. The British weren't finished yet. World War II finished them, right? But World War I, the pound, the British pound, the currency was dominant in the world. After World War I, the dollar becomes also equal with the pound in terms of the key currency. The U.S. becomes the global manufacturing power in the world, kind of like China is now, right? It was the U.S. at that time. Now, to enable the U.S. and U.S. capitalists to become, co-gorillas on the block here with the U.K., certain policies had to change. Fiscal policy, which is government spending, right, and government taxing, had to change. In World War I, we have a total new tax system comes out of World War I in the U.S. We have the income tax for the first time, the corporate income tax, the individual income tax. Why? Because the U.S., if you're going to be a world power, you have to have a world military. And it did not have a world military until World War I. It had to pay for it somehow. It did with these new taxes. You know, if you look at the Spanish-American War, 1898, how did the U.S. pay for that war? It levied property taxes on the rich, and it got a lot of pushback. And the rich said, no, you got to have a better system. What else comes out of World War I, even before that, is the Federal Reserve is created in 1913. So you have modern monetary systems, structures, and modern fiscal system structures, a modern currency structure to enable the U.S. to become, the big challenger and the big second biggest boy on the block here in the 1920s. You have another restructuring of the economy coming out of World War II, when the rest of the capitalist world collapses pretty much economically, right? The cost of war and the devastation of war. The U.S. becomes the dominant hegemon economically, right? The dollar is the only global currency worth anything in the world. All the exports are U.S. because no one else can produce anything after the war. The Federal Reserve is just paying for all the treasury bonds and debt that occurred. Global trade is dominated by the U.S. Fiscal policy, we start this huge military industrial complex coming out of the war, financing it. We go after the unions, and we pass the Taft-Hartley Act in 47 that pretty much tames the unions permanently here in the post-war period. That's the second restructuring. Now, that restructuring is a certain mix, as all these restructurings are. Accompanying it is a certain mix of policies, economic policies, fiscal policies, monetary policies, industrial policies, and external trade policies. Each restructuring changes the mix of those policies to enable the restructuring and enable the capitalist class to either restore or expand its power domestically and globally. It's always a class-based restructuring. Class in terms of dealing with domestic class challenges and dealing with foreign challengers, capitalist challengers or non-capitalist challengers. That's what the restructuring is about. And coming out of the crisis of the 1970s, we saw another restructuring. And that third restructuring we call neoliberalism. It's the same thing. Back then, we used to call it Reaganomics or Thatcher economics. You know, Thatcher was the PM of Britain here. The Anglo-Americans come up with neoliberalism. And that's another mix of these four policy areas, right? Fiscal, monetary, industrial, and foreign or external, right? What is the neoliberal mix, and does it still exist today? Is it under challenge? Is it breaking down since the 2008-9 crash? Yeah, it's under challenge. It's breaking down in some ways. Obama couldn't put it back together again. Trump couldn't put it back together, and Biden is trying to put it. But the contradictions and problems in neoliberal policy mix are growing. The policies are getting weak. Just as before other restructurings, they got weak. They didn't work. And the capitalists had to come up with a new set of policies. They had to rejuggle these four areas to, one, you know, depress the social challenges, the unions in the 70s, for example. What was the challenge to capital? The challenge was the unions and the social movements, right? What was Reaganomics neoliberalism? It was, you know, dealing with that. And they dealt with that in the industrial policy. You know, people don't realize where the unions were in the early 70s. And, you know, you hear a lot about negotiations and strikes today and negotiations, and they come up with, you know, maybe 5-6% wage increase. The biggest, best unions, you know, come up with, you know, 5 to 7% first year wage increases in a 5-year agreement, ties them down for 5 years, right? Well, back then in the early 1970s, we had the biggest strike wave in the history of this country and the most successful union strike wave in this history of this country. Construction unions walked out, then the Teamsters, then the auto workers, and then the longshore workers, you know. It was very successful. So successful that Nixon had to impose a wage freeze and then wage controls and roll them back. But how much did the unions originally win in 70, 71, 72? I'll tell you, 25% wage increase in the first year of a 3-year contract. 25% wage increase. Massive win. And they had to call in Nixon and the governor, the capitalist state, to put a kibosh on it and to roll it back. And throughout the rest of the 70s, they developed a new way of dealing with the unions. And you had a rise of new forms of business capitalist organization, the Business Council, the Business Roundtable, made up of 100 largest CEOs in the country, right? And that force proposed in the Carter administration in the late 70s, neoliberal tax policies, neoliberal monetary policies, neoliberal industrial policies. In other words, it comes out of business. Neoliberalism comes from business recommendations to the government. And the government, then Carter and then Reagan, implement these things. Now, what are the 4 elements of neoliberalism that we saw instituted under Reagan and even before under Carter, and that have continued for 40 years, that are now coming under stress and contradiction? What are the 4 areas? I'll tell you. 1, monetary policy. Neoliberal monetary policy is to keep interest rates artificially low. The Federal Reserve Central Bank keeps interest rates chronically low. Now, periodically, when you got an inflation crisis, it reverses that and temporarily raises interest rates, but then it quickly drops them down again, right? So the long-term policy is keep interest rates low. Why? Low interest rates keep the dollar low, the value of the US dollar. If the interest rates rise, the dollar in value rises. Now, US corporations that have moved offshore want a low interest rate and a low value of the dollar, because the profits they make offshore, when they want to repatriate them to the United States, they got to buy dollars. If the interest rates in dollars are high, they can buy fewer dollars to send back home. If the interest rates in dollar are low, they can buy a lot of dollars and send it back home. So, this imperial expansion during this neoliberal period, they called it globalization, but it really was corporate imperialism, going around the world, expanding around the world. It relies on chronic low rates. Okay, so that's monetary policy, chronic low rates. And when there's a crisis like we had in 2008-9 or COVID, right, to keep rates low at zero interest rates in 2008, the Fed has to throw a lot of money into the economy, big supply of money to keep interest rates low. And that's built up over time. And if the Fed is doing that, throwing money into the economy, it's issuing issuing treasury bonds, right, to get the money. Buyers buy the treasury bonds, and then the Fed has to pay interest rates on those bonds. And when you get a massive amount of treasuries out there that the Fed is paying interest rates on, and the interest rates are higher, so it has to pay more interest rates like we're having the last year, right? What happens is the Fed's debt explodes. And right now, the Fed's debt, they call it its balance sheet, is $9 trillion. Okay, $9 trillion in 2021-22, right? And it has to pay interest on that. Okay, so the Fed, in keeping interest rates low, is causing its balance sheet to expand. And when it has to pay interest on the bonds it sells, right, the interest on the debt rises. Now that's a fiscal problem, right? Not a Fed problem. In other words, what do you got in government fiscal policy? You've got government spending, which is both on domestic and defense. We'll talk about that, ballooning. And you've got taxation to pay for the deficit and debt. And it never covers all the deficit and debt. Taxation doesn't do that. It's not enough, right? 60% of your deficit is because your taxes are too low. Why are they too low? Because in the last 20 years, the US has cut taxes by 15, maybe 16 trillion now, dollars. It's cut taxes, mostly on investors and corporations and the rich. $15 trillion in tax cuts. At the same time, it spent $8 trillion on wars. Well, wait a minute, 15 trillion tax cuts, 60% cause of the deficit, 8 trillion on wars, that's $22 trillion. And then when you have these crises, like in 2008-9, you've got to spend more on social and COVID in 2021, that adds, maybe another 3-4 trillion to the total deficit and debt, right? Look, the national debt is just the accumulation of annual deficits, right? But you get deficits because you've increased spending too much, or you lowered taxes too much, or you're spending more and more on interest on the debt because interest rates are up, right? Those are the three big causes, right? We've been spending tremendous amount of money on these wars in the Middle East, $8 trillion, and now in Ukraine, and now in Israel, right? Just blank checks, right? Spending to protect the empire, the U.S. global economic empire, which is a reality here. That's what all this war spending is about. Pentagon spending is $850 billion now, but that's not the whole defense spending. You see, there's other defense costs. All of the energy, the oil and gas and whatever that the U.S. military buys is not in the Pentagon budget, it's in the Energy Department budget. And the U.S. military is the single biggest individual consumer of oil in the world, right? So that's all somewhere else. The veterans spending is not in the Pentagon budget, it's somewhere else, right? You've got $75 billion a year that doesn't get reported in the defense budget because it's called the black budget on new weapon systems that no one wants to know. So even Congress doesn't get to know them. Right? You've got all these other areas, and we're spending about $1.1 trillion every year on defense. Every year on defense. Okay. So that defense spending is rising, rising, rising. Social programs, well, they bump up during these crises, 2008-9, go down, they take it away. 2021 bumped up, took it away, but it contributes some as well. And then you got interest on the debt. Now in 2019, the interest on the debt, national debt, was about $280 billion. You know what the interest on the debt is today after all these rate increases? $650 billion. This year, we're going to have to pay the borrowers, the investors, the capitalists, the corporations who bought treasury bonds. We have to pay them $650 billion. In 2 or 3 years, it's going to be $900 billion. It's going to be bigger than the defense budget, right? Because of the deficit and higher interest rates. So, if you look at neoliberal fiscal policy, what is it? It's unlimited defense spending. It's occasional spending on bailouts, right? And it's also, don't worry about the deficit and the debt. This year, the deficit is going to be almost $2 trillion. Well, the Federal Reserve has to throw out and sell more treasury bonds than ever before to raise the money, because the tax system doesn't do it. You can't pay the deficits. We run a chronic deficit every year, $2 trillion. That's after our taxes. And we've cut taxes $15-16 trillion. Trump cut them by $4.5 trillion. Obama cut them by $6 trillion, extending the Bush $3.8 trillion tax cuts of the first decade. Obama just extended that. That cost $6 trillion, and also, even more tax cuts for the rich. And then Trump comes along, $4.5 trillion more, and here comes Biden, trillions more. All these tax cuts. Never in the history of the U.S. have we funded wars, and we've been in a chronic war for 20 years now. Have we ever funded wars by cutting taxes? We always raise taxes. Like in World War II, we paid for part of World War II by raising taxes. 90% on the rich was the tax rate in World War II, right? What's the tax rate now? Effective tax rate is about 12%, right? So we've always raised taxes some, as well as borrowing money to pay for the defense spending boom. Since 2001, we have cut taxes by $15-16 trillion, while we increase spending on wars by $8 trillion. Well, figure that out. That's not going to work. That's why you've got a $33 trillion national debt. 15 trillion of that, tax cuts, mostly for the rich, right? 8 trillion of that, wars, throwing money down the rat hole in the Middle East for nothing, right? That's 22, 23 trillion. You add another 5 trillion maybe for the bailouts, right? And then the rest is just increases in the Medicare and so forth, right? So what you get is the 33 trillion. It's not rocket science to know why we have a $33 trillion debt. It's the policies of war spending and tax cutting, right? And bailouts of the capitalist system when it gets into a crisis. Now that $34 trillion is just the government debt. It's not the Federal Reserve debt. The Federal Reserve has a debt of $8 trillion as well. On top of that, where does the Federal Reserve debt come from? Throwing all this free money into investors and corporations and buyers of bonds and keeping interest rates down to zero. Okay, that's another 9 trillion. Now the Fed is trying to unload some of that debt over the past year and a half. That's called quantitative tightening, a fancy word for saying, the Fed has to buy back some of those bonds, right? And it's throwing money into the economy to buy back some of those bonds. Actually, it's also issuing more bonds to cover the $2 trillion debt, right? So you got all these bonds flooding. The Fed is flooding the economy by issuing bonds, increasing the supply of bonds. Now, when you increase the supply of anything, remember, the price goes down, doesn't it? Yeah, it goes down. So the price of bonds are collapsing. And when it comes to bonds, whether it's government or treasury or corporate bonds, if the price goes down, the interest rate goes up. Okay, that's the way bonds work. So if the Fed is throwing $2 trillion to cover the deficit, into the economy of bonds, and the prices are collapsing, which is happening, right? Long-term bonds, particularly 30 years and mortgage bonds. If the price is collapsing and the interest rates are rising, which they are, right? Interest on that is going to cost the government more and more. But if the price goes down and interest rates rise, you got a problem in the real economy. And that's what we're seeing right now. The Fed is flooding because of the fiscal deficit, you see, because of the fiscal deficit and its very high monetary balance sheet deficit. It's throwing money into the economy at a rate of $2 trillion to cover the shortfall between revenues, tax revenues, which have been cut in the last 20 years. It's a no-win situation here. Monetary policy is full of contradictions now. Monetary policy, the government, the Federal Reserve can't raise interest rates more than 5.5%, 6%. Short-term rates we're talking about. The Fed cannot control these long-term rates. That's the economy that controls the demand for long-term. And we see that rates rising because the Fed is flooding the economy, increasing the supply, driving down the price, raising the interest rates. Right? And a problem on top of what the Fed is doing to drive up rates here, long-term rates, is that the demand for treasuries globally is falling. Demand, if it increases, the price goes up for the bonds. If the demand is declining, the price goes up, goes down, and rates go back up, right? So what's happening is China is not buying the treasuries it used to. It used to hold 1.1 trillion. Now it's reduced it to 800 billion because of U.S. Policies going after China and preparing for war over Taiwan. Also, you've got Japan slowing down its purchase of treasuries. Those two countries are the big purchasers of U.S. treasuries, right? Japan and China. The demand is going down because the dollar is high and because of sanctions and geopolitics from the two biggest purchasers and elsewhere in the world. So demand going down, the price of bonds go down, in addition to excess supply of bonds by the Treasury, by the Fed, driving price down. We have these two forces, demand and supply, driving bonds prices down, which are driving interest rates, 30-year rates up. And the higher the rates go, the riskier it is for zombie corporations and regional banks. We saw this regional bank crisis because interest rates were rising too fast, right? That's why they stopped raising interest rates, because it was beginning to crash the regional commercial banking system. And that's why one of the main reasons why the Fed has stopped raising rates. But rates are going up long term that the Fed has no control over, because it's got to finance this $2 trillion and Biden geopolitics, attacking and sanctions and so forth, means these other countries are not buying bonds as much. The demand's going down. So net, you've got this chronic long-term problem of long-term rates rising, which if they continue to rise, even though the Fed doesn't raise short-term rates, if they continue to rise, it's going to put more pressure on the financial system. You're going to see what's called junk bonds and junk loans, high yield bonds, zombie companies that have to borrow to stay alive, not being able to borrow anymore and going bankrupt. You're going to see that. You see the commercial real estate market, which is in deep trouble right now. Higher interest rates means it's going to crash. You've got residential real estate, in other words, mortgages and so forth, which are pretty low. They got frozen in at about 3.5% to 4% here during COVID, but a lot of them are 5-year variable rates, and a big amount of variable home mortgages are going to reset next year, trillions of dollars, and by hundreds of dollars, and homeowners aren't going to be able to pay. So, the higher mortgage rates when they reset next year, 24, 25. So on top of, the commercial real estate problem, you're going to have a residential real estate problem and a regional banking problem. All of those are areas in which if the Fed rates continue to rise, whether it does it, itself or has to throw money into the market, this has to throw treasury bonds into the market, which it has no control of. It's got to do that. It's got to raise long-term rates. You're going to see financial problems erupt here another year, 18 months, if this continues. These are the contradictions of fiscal monetary policy. It doesn't work the way it used to. You've got monetary policy, which doesn't stimulate the economy very much anymore, and it doesn't bring down interest rates much anymore. And you got fiscal policy of this massive debt, 34 trillion, and interest on it going through the roof. And the national debt will be 40 trillion here easily by 2028. And you pay even more interest on the debt. So you've got a crisis in fiscal policy, and you've got a crisis in monetary policy, and they're both exacerbating each other, making each other worse. Now, this is late neoliberal economic policy, which isn't working as well. And this began to appear under Obama, got worse under Trump, is really worse now under Biden. Fiscal monetary policy is broken. It's not working the way it used to. External policy, trade policy and monetary policy is also a problem because of the sanctions. They are shooting, the American elite is shooting themselves in the foot, and they are undermining, at least those who are making these policies in the Biden administration, are undermining their own empire, right? We see these sanctions causing a lot of concern about other economies around the world, not just Russia and China, which have been able to circumvent these sanctions significantly, right? But the US, as part of the sanctions, seized $300 billion of Russian assets in the West. It froze them, it seized them, it stole them, piracy, right? It's got a lot of other countries worried, gee, maybe you could freeze our money that exists, in Western banks. I don't know that I want to buy things in dollars anymore. Let's look for an alternative currency, and that's coming. The sanctions have generated a move for alternative currencies. Part of the U.S. economic empire has been that oil and global commodities and resources had to be bought with dollars, right? Dollar was the premier trading currency and reserve currency. Right? What's happened is the dollar is now declining, accelerating decline as the global trading currency of choice and reserve currency as well. The dollar is in decline. The dollar is the linchpin of the global economic empire. If it declines, the US has less control over other countries economically. And that's been occurring. And I would argue that's why the US is resorting more to direct force, military force, because its soft power is declining. Its ability to get these other countries to do what it wants by saying, well, if you don't do this, we're going to wreck your economy here because we control the dollar, right? Other institutions of the empire are also in decline. There is the international payment system of the dollar called SWIFT. That's an acronym, SWIFT. In other words, you pay for oil and commodities in dollars, right? And because this payment goes through U.S. banks. The U.S. Can see who's buying commodities with the dollar, who's using the dollar globally. The SWIFT allows it to see who's violating sanctions. So there's a movement away from SWIFT as well, away from the dollar and away from the SWIFT to a new international payment system. And the U.S. won't be able to see who's violating sanctions on oil purchases or whatever. Mm-hmm. These two key elements of the U.S. empire, the payment system and the currency, are in decline, no doubt about it. And where is the source of the growth? It's the BRICS. This group of other countries, emerging market countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now they added 7 more: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Argentina, and so forth, right? These are all oil-producing countries, right? They're going to come up soon, within 6 months, in their own currency, probably based upon oil and maybe the Chinese yuan, right? Some basket of goods and currencies will be the new currency in which oil and energy and commodities, be it aluminum and iron or whatever, and wheat and corn and whatever, will be bought and sold. And the U.S. empire will be blind as to who's buying this stuff, right? And the dollar will decline. There'll be less demand for dollars. And remember, if there's less demand for dollars, there's going to be less demand for treasury bonds, and the price of bonds are going to go down and the interest rates are going to continue going up. You see how all these things are connected here. They're not stovepipes. Fiscal, monetary policy, trade policy are all interrelated, and the contradictions in one exacerbate contradictions in the other. And this is the economic source of the empire's and neoliberal decline. The BRICS are also challenging the U.S. World Bank. If you look at the institutions of the U.S. empire, it's the dollar, it's the SWIFT system, it's the IMF, and it's the World Bank and some other things, right? Those are the 4 keystones of the U.S. empire that was set up in the late 1940s under the previous restructuring and boosted in the 1980s, restored, I would say, in the 1980s, because they were under threat in the 70s, restored once again for the next 40 years as part of the neoliberal restructuring, right? But if you look at those 4 institutions, as I said, alternative to the SWIFT payment system, alternative to the US dollar, alternative to World Bank, that's China's Belt and Road system, an infrastructure system, finance system that other countries of the world are joining, and instead of the World Bank, which is controlled by the U.S. You see, and then you have the IMF, International Monetary Fund, which provides bailouts for countries when their currency begins to collapse. Well, there will be an IMF-like alternative as well that they're talking about, and the source of the challenge is not just China, it's not just Russia, it's the BRICS, and it's the expansion of the BRICS system. And the U.S. is retreating now globally and circling the wagons of its closest allies called the G7, the Europeans and the Japanese, right? It's like shrinking and getting ready for this big competition with the BRICS. But it all represents the decline of the U.S. empire. It's an economic, you look at the economics of this, that determines the decline of the empire, and the politics are the reflection of it. In other words, the decline of the economic empire eliminates American capitalist weapons to force the world to go along with the empire. So the U.S. resorts to force, more wars. Okay, I'm sorry it was a long-winded, but I thought I needed to explain neoliberalism as the latest restructuring of restoring U.S. hegemonic power, both domestically, taming the unions, taming the social movements of the 70s, which it did. At the same time, it's taming and containing its capitalist competitors. First it was the Japanese, now it's the Chinese and the BRICS and so forth. That's why I say neoliberalism is really a class-based policy. You got to understand it as a class-based policy, restoring and expanding capitalist hegemony and economic empire when it's under challenge. But because there are contradictions in these policies are intensifying since 2008 and 9, the ability to use economic levers and soft power has declined. And concurrent with that, therefore, the U.S. has been in 23 years of constant warfare, first in the Middle East, and then pushing, NATO East and challenging Russia, which has erupted now in big time in Ukraine, planning to go to war with China over Taiwan, right? All these are extreme reactions to the decline and challenges to American economic empire, which requires, a new restructuring at some point.
There's so much. First of all, their explanation is necessary because when you hear the word neoliberal, it has so many like ambiguous connotations. I don't think people even understand it. It's almost like they just pull it out of the air and just use it to describe everything. Neoliberal this, neoliberal that. But so that requires a dissection. So we appreciate that explanation for sure.
Let me just sum up. Neoliberalism as an idea originated in the immediate post-World War II period by intellectuals on the far right, particularly the Austrian school and Hayek and those people, right? They came up with neoliberalism, which, liberalism, classical liberalism is free enterprise, deregulation, privatization, right? And that was their mantra. We're coming out of the Depression and World War II, a lot of government involvement. We got to get government out of this. We got to return to 19th century liberalism where government was not involved, right? But neoliberalism is not liberal. It's quite the contrary. It's an oxymoron term. It's nothing liberal about it. When you talk about deep government involvement in fiscal monetary policy and massive deficits and debt and, all this government involvement, it's the opposite of liberal. It's not neoliberal. It's an oxymoron term. Neoliberalism is just a euphemistic term to cover up what is a class-based policy at home and an imperial policy around the world. It's a form of imperialism, and it's a form of class conflict, right? To deal with challenges at home and abroad, to restore capitalist hegemony, and using the state apparatus and state economic policies to help capital restore itself and to expand itself. But now those policies are not working very well and increasingly in decline. So the empire cannot restore itself as well as it did in the past, which means they're going to have to, at some point, try to find a new mix of economic policies to restore it again. That will be the next capitalist restructuring, but that's not around the corner.
I tell you, there's just so much going on in my head. I got a few more questions for you. One's like not that heavy of a question, I don't think, because you alluded to it earlier with the student loan debt. But I was talking to a friend before we got on, a conservative, but I think a conflicted conservative, because it's crazy how you hear a lot of the segment of the population don't want to see these constant wars. Like it's definitely rising below the surface. You can feel it. Even though you don't see it all over TV, you talk to everyday people, they're like, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep going back to this playbook over and over? I mean, the $100 billion package that you alluded to, which $10 billion, I think they're trying to, if it gets approved by Congress, which we know that Congress won't approve, they're going to resist what the president says. Yeah, right. So $10 billion is supposed to go to Israel. Then you have the border security, money going towards that, money going towards Ukraine, the crux of it. And so I was teasing my friend and said, I mean, hell, I don't know why you guys complain about Biden. I mean, he's like the perfect neocon. I mean, he's packaged with the D next to his name, and he does the same shit that the Bushes and everyone else, basically the tradition, just carrying the baton and keep doing the same thing more effectively. It's like Glenn Ford said, the most effective evil is the Democratic Party, and then the Republicans get demonized more openly, it seems sometimes. But just thinking about that package and just the way it's just thrown out, and it's almost like a justification because the government's spending so much money anyway. So what's another $100 billion going to be? Like that's the scary part about this. And going back to last year, $877 billion, 40% of the world's military expenditures from one country, more than 10, the next 10 countries combined. Like you can't make this stuff up. And is it just going to be like what happens? What does that mean for our money? Does that even mean anything at that point? I mean, these figures that you gave earlier are alarming. Like this is some stuff that you would think of in Monopoly or something. You don't think that this is real. This kind of the amount of money we're in debt, but the everyday person we're expected to pay our debt, but the government can do what it wants.
Yeah, the government can make up and sell treasury bonds. Yeah, it doesn't have to, or it can monetize the debt if it wants to. Look, let's look at, is Bidenomics neoliberal? Well, let's look at these four areas of neoliberalism that I've been talking about. What about fiscal policy? Neoliberalism is uncontrolled military defense war spending. Well, what's Biden doing? Well, he spent 150 to 200 billion already on Ukraine alone. What about Israel? Well, the talk is $10 billion, right? Well, you forget that under neoliberalism since 1979, the U.S. has been giving $3 to $5 billion to Israel every year. They don't need that, right? Well, why are they giving it to Israel? So Israel can turn around, take the money, and buy U.S. airplanes and stuff, right? The money just keeps cycling back to the military-industrial complex in this country. The U.S. Has a stockpile of bombs in Israel, 25,000 bombs on a military base that the U.S. has stockpiled, right? And it's recently told Israel, you got unlimited access to it, go use it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's an interesting thing. And now we're going to give them $10 billion more. And then the cost of moving 2 aircraft carrier task forces there, right? And the U.S. is sending combat troops into its base in Jordan. The U.S. has like 800 bases around the world. Right? The U.S. is the only empire, right? And it's under challenge and threat. Biden goes to Israel and, he says, whatever Israel wants, whatever they want, U.S. foreign policy took a big turn in the late 90s. You see, when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, the previous generation of diplomats and politicians assured Russia that NATO would not move east, and it didn't for a whole decade. But then at the close of Clinton's administration, all of a sudden, it starts expanding NATO east. It adds Poland and a few others, right? In 1999. It expands even further the next decade, right? In 2008, I think it was at the Budapest conference here of NATO, it said, our plan is to bring Ukraine and Georgia, Georgia, the country, into NATO as well. It declared that, right? Why this move east, right? And then in 2014, the U.S. engineers a coup to overthrow the elected president who was trying to have relations both with Europe and and Russia. All right, the U.S. didn't want that, and they overthrew it. And the Undersecretary of State for the East Europe, and her name is Victoria Nuland, who was a finance capitalist out of Chicago, by the way, right? Victoria Nuland says, we pulled off the coup. we spent $5 billion, she says, publicly to pull off the coup. And of course, they used a lot of these neo-Nazi forces, street thugs, to do it. Right. And then she gets caught saying, oh, we're going to appoint the Ukrainian PM, this guy, I forget his name. I forget what they called him, got appointed, the PM.
Yes.
Well, the U.S. sets up the PM. And then Victoria Nuland, within a year, gets appointed as the economic czar for Ukraine. Right? And Ukraine has to change its constitution to allow a foreigner to become an economic czar. And from that point, here comes American companies flooding into Ukraine, buying up Ukraine under the guide of economic czar Victoria Nuland, right? And the U.S. penetrates the economy of Ukraine, and of course the military follows. The military hadn't built up the Ukrainian army by this time, 2015. The U.S. proposes and agrees to a phony treaty called Minsk with the Russians, because that's when the Russians took back Crimea in 2014. It agrees to a phony treaty, and they admit years later in 2022, the European parties to that Minsk treaty. In Germany, Hollande, the president of France, and I forget her name, the chancellor of Germany, they admit in 2022.
In Merkel?
Merkel, yeah, they admit 22. Oh, that was just to buy time. Publicly, they said that was just to buy time to build up the Ukrainian army, And then in 2021, the Ukrainian army goes on the offensive. Why all of a sudden, the Donbass, the east, starts, shelling the east, breakaway provinces, the two provinces. Why in 2021? Because the U.S. says, go for it. Think about it. Biden comes into office in January 2021. 6 months later, he pulls out helter-skelter out of Afghanistan, right? Gets that off the table. Messy job, right? And 3 months later, he's telling Ukraine, we're going to bring you into NATO. And Zelenskyy, of course, says, oh, we're going into NATO, right? And, oh, by the way, we need nuclear weapons as well. And the Russians are trying to desperately, at the end of 21, trying to talk with the U.S. about this security issue. And the U.S. won't even meet with the Russians to discuss it. And they start slapping sanctions on Russia. Well, they provoked Russia to invade. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted Russia to invade. I wrote an article in January 2022. People can read it on my blog, jackrasmus.com, called 10 Reasons Why the U.S. Wants Russia to Invade Ukraine. And then I followed it up with an analysis a year later. Go read those 10 reasons. The U.S. had a lot to gain from Russia invading Ukraine, and they taunted them and provoked them, and Putin fell right for it, right for it. This is what I call the Brzezinski 2.0 doctrine. Zbigniew Brzezinski was another East European immigrant that left after World War II. I think it was Poland, and he came to Canada, and then he ended up at Harvard, became a big advisor to politicians on the Eastern Europe. He became the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter. And in 1979, Brzezinski went to Carter. This is all in his memoirs, by the way. Goes to Carter and he says, let's destabilize the new government, which was the secular government, by the way, in Afghanistan. Let's destabilize it. And that will bring the Russians in. They will ask the Russians to come in, and then the Russians will get bogged down and will finance the peasants there in a long war and undermine Russia. And that was the Brzezinski 1.0 doctrine. And it worked. The Russians weren't asked to come in until 6 months after that July beginning of the decision under Carter to destabilize Afghanistan. They were asked to come in 6 months later, and they did, and it was on, and it did undermine the Soviet Union. And I believe that the Democrats have the same strategy, right? This is Brzezinski 2.0. It was to lure Russia into Ukraine and hopefully undermine its economy and its political system, which of course is not happening this time. Right? So, this was a plan, by the way, that the Rand Corporation had developed way back in 2016. And it said, okay, we have two big threats. The Rand Corporation is a think tank. Two big threats to the US empire long term. China is the biggest threat, but Russia's a threat as well. The US has to neutralize Russia before it goes after China. And that was sitting on the desks here of the government in 2016. Problem is, Trump got elected in 2016, and it got shelved for 4 years. But as soon as Biden comes back into office here in 2021, it got dusted off. And in 6 months, it was being implemented, and Afghanistan pullout was part of that. You can't see, you don't understand the pullout of Afghanistan if you don't understand the U.S. plans to go into Ukraine. Right? And then we're off. But to get back to the point, this cost us almost $200 billion, and it's rising. Right? 10 billion for Israel, that will rise. Mm-hmm. And now they propose the neocons have proposed, who have been running foreign policy, by the way, in the U.S. since late Clinton. You see, when Clinton got caught with a zipper down, right, and he almost got impeached, he turned around and gave anybody whatever they wanted. Corporations, tax cuts, and everything. The banks, deregulation, and the neocons, a big role in his regime. And then when Bush came in, he just deepened it even further, right? And we've been our foreign policy has been the result of neocons for 20 years, right? The neocons, the state policy has not changed. Presidents change, but they haven't been able to reverse anything. Even if they wanted to, and they go along with this anyway. Biden is just political putty in the hands of the neocons, whatever they want. And every time their policy turns out to be a disaster, they just double down. Yeah. That's all they're doing. And now they're talking about, look, if the Russians look like they're winning Ukraine, we got to engage in a tactical nuclear war. I mean, they're talking about it freely, tactical nukes. No such thing as tactical nukes. It turns into strategic nukes immediately. So this is where these people are. They're crazy. Who are they? Well, Victoria Nuland now, she's number 2 in the State Department. She's got promoted. Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken. These are all the current crop of neocons, right? And they're getting us deeper into war, incessant war. But, we can't finance wars and the cost of defense and the Pentagon without exacerbating these huge deficits, right? Without raising interest on the debt, without ballooning our national debt. They've reached the end game of this using war, to maintain the global empire.
I have to, we won't get into the student loan thing. We may say that for another time, but I did want to get this in before we went. The Trumplicans is what I call them. The Trumplicans are so dead set on getting Jim Jordan in the Speaker of the House position. And I just laughed at the tweet that was put up by Jim Jordan. He said, we must stop attacking each other and come together. There's too much at stake. And then says, let's get back to working on the crisis at the southern border, inflation, and helping Israel. How contradictory can you be? America first, but yet we're going to focus on other countries. Let's fund Israel more money. You've already talked about the $3.7 billion annually that's already part of the military budget as it is. And then he's talking about securing the border. It's just all over the place. These people have no principles, no consistency whatsoever. And you can really just use their own words against them. But I think I put a status up last week and just said, honestly, everyone in Congress is a neocon. I mean, that's really what it is now. That you've said it yourself, the corporate party of America, these two these two relationships. It's a red-blue marriage, is what it is, and they
Yeah,
get
well,
funded by the same people.
well, you know, as I said, one of the hallmarks characteristics of neoliberalism is they don't care about deficits and debt. They really don't, you know. I mean, and that's a real change from previous policy mixes. If you don't care about deficits and debt, then you don't care about ballooning your defense and war budget and more spending, you know, which is 1.1 trillion now, defense spending, 850 billion just Pentagon and going up. Right? You don't care about that. What you try to do is cut social programs, but you can't cut social programs enough to make up for this deficit, you know, and the deficit is rising and the debt is rising, you know. I mean, we passed the so-called debt ceiling bill here in the spring, and we still got almost $2 trillion of deficit. Right. And once again, the deficit is not social programs spending, it's war spending, right? It's interest on the debt that's ballooning, and it's tax cuts. Trump cut taxes $4.5 trillion. The Democrats don't want to cut taxes. You know, we saw that during the whole COVID social programs. They tried to initially fund it by taking back some of the Trump tax cuts, $4.5 trillion, right? No. That got shut down in the Senate. I mean, the corporate interests Democratic Party do not want to cut the Trump taxes any more than the Republicans want to cut the Trump taxes. You know, they're in total agreement. That's why I say we have a single party democracy, if you can call a single party a democracy in this country, with two wings. One's called the Republicans, one's called the Democrats. Right? Two wings, and they are in total agreement on these economic issues. And they keep throwing all these cultural issues at us to distract us. You know, the Democrats have wokeism and identity politics, and the Republicans, they have conspiracy theories and QAnon. And, you know, it looks like there's a difference between them. And in the meantime, they're all in agreement on the economic policies, and they're picking our pockets while they play the shell game on us on cultural issues, right? They keep us totally distracted, right? It's a single party system, right? And they make sure, both of them make sure that no third party can challenge and get on the ballot. I mean, the Democrats rail against Republicans and you know, their gerrymandering and their voter suppression, and it's true. But what do the Democrats do, right? They don't hold any primaries, because they don't want anybody to challenge Joe Biden, right? So no primaries, and they're doing everything they can to make sure that Trump does not get on the ballot in key swing states, right? And they're doing everything they can to knock Greens and other third-party challenges off local elections. The Democrats are anti-democracy as much as the Republicans are, right? We have a single-party system where these two wings of the corporate elite, right, are in total agreement, and they're just enriching the corporate elite. You know, they're just funneling money at these guys, you know. That's why income and wealth inequality is ballooning. Now, here's a statistic for you, right? We talked about $15 trillion in tax cuts and so forth. You know how much the Fortune 500 companies, you know, there's millions of companies, corporations in this country, right? Just the top 500. You know how much they've given their shareholders in stock buybacks and dividend payouts since 2010, 13 years, right? You know how much? $16 trillion in stock buybacks and dividend payouts. Wow, there's your income inequality. You know, the 1%, those who own the stock in these big corporations, they're getting filthy rich. And the monetary policy and the fiscal policy are all now geared to enriching these people more and more and more. That's another reason why it's dead. Fiscal monetary policy is grossly inefficient for stabilizing the economy. A boy is working overtime on enriching the 1% in corporate America.
Dr. Jack Rasmus, is there like a final plug or any departing words you have for my audience? We've appreciated this episode 72 with this wealth of information. I know what I'm going to do tonight, people. 6:30 p.m. Eastern. This is going to premiere on Kiko's Freethinkers Forum YouTube channel. and I share the links with everyone. But there's a lot to absorb from this interview. But do you have any final words for my audience?
Yeah, the only way this is going to change is when you have a truly independent organization, political party that is not tied in to corporate America, right? That's independent and it contends and challenges for the institutions of power in this country. In other words, the Congress, the legislatures, the courts, and everything. There's no shortcut, you know, and that solution looks pretty bleak right now, but it can change pretty dramatically, pretty quickly when it reaches a point of no return. Right? I really think we're approaching that in this decade. The American people are being squeezed terribly, and force is being used more and more, not just abroad, but here domestically at home to control people. And you know, it's going to explode at some point, and then you know perhaps we could form a real alternative. Right. The number one issue is the organizational issue, the organization question. How are we going to contend with these two parties who are blocking everything, in the meantime enriching their friends and endangering us and our families? You know, the number one thing that I worry about is this increasing aggressive warlike policies of the U.S. You know, that, as you say, both sides of these elites, politicals, seem to be locked into. And the threat, you know, to your children, your grandchildren, my children, grandchildren, you know, this has me very, very much worried, even on top of what appears to be an economic, slow roll train track economic decline going on globally and domestically. If you want to follow my writings, you know, my blog, jackrasmus.com, where I also post my various interviews on these and other subjects. If you're on Twitter, follow me on Twitter. I follow day-to-day, you know, statements here on Twitter. That's at a Dr. Jack Rasmus. You can follow me on Twitter. Follow me on my blog, jackrasmus.com. And I have a radio show every Friday on the Progressive Radio Network called Alternative Visions. That's out of New York at, I think it's 2 p.m. on Friday afternoons. And it's also a podcast. You can follow it at Podbean and Apple and so forth, right? Which also on my blog, I will post the link to it every week. So follow what I say there. You know, on those three sources and in these kind of interviews. And if anyone, you know, really wants to ask me questions or something, you know, you can do it through Twitter or you can email me or whatever. And that's pretty much what I have to say, except that, boy, this next year is going to be very critical, both economically, because inflation is not abating. And we're going to have financial crises if the Fed keeps raising rates, long-term rates in particular. And the economic stresses are growing, right? It's a slow, chronic train wreck going on in the economy. And the global empire is under increasing challenge and decline. And when that happens with the neocons running the show, risky, violent responses that endanger us all. I mean, that's the scenario as I see it here going forward. It's a very risky time, and politically, we're going to have a lot of upheaval here come the election and right after. You know that. If Trump runs, you know, that's going to cause the political elites to react even more aggressively. And if he is prevented from running, that's going to exacerbate the situation. Both, one of those is going to happen. One of those is going to happen. So I see a lot of domestic political instability coming. And I see increasing international political instability coming as the U.S. resorts more and more to wars. Ukraine is not going to be settled. I mean, the war in Ukraine is over. militarily. It's over. The failure of the Ukrainian offensive and the relationship of money and weapons and men and so forth. The military is over. The only question is, can the Biden administration put a cover on it for a year and get through the elections? Well, we could talk about Ukraine another time in more detail, but that war is over. And of course, the problem is the war in the Middle East is just beginning, and that's even scarier in some ways. But Biden seems to be totally committed to both. He doesn't understand, in my opinion. I mean, he's a real intellectual lightweight, in my opinion.
That's a compliment for him.
Yeah, I mean, this is the senator from Delaware. Corporations put him in power in Delaware. They selected him to be a vice president here. They selected him to be the president. He's just a mouthpiece, and a not increasingly ineffective mouthpiece, I think. But that's dangerous. That means the neocons running foreign policy show, and who's running the domestic policy? Probably the bankers, right? So it doesn't look good for us here in the U.S. In the short term, and even less so in the longer term. The quality of leadership, and we didn't talk about it, but as the empire declines, as these neoliberal policies begin to fail, right, it gets reflected in the political structure and system of this country. There is a political element of neoliberalism, and we see that emerging, which is anti-democratic, anti-democracy. To keep these policies going, they have to restrict democracy and our rights here domestically even more in order to keep the neoliberal train from rolling off the track. So they're linked. They're linked. Okay, well, we could go on, but that's enough, I think. My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
No, it's great that you're explaining those connections to people. And I know my audience will appreciate those explanations, because some of the people are coming in for maybe the first time in their life, or at least given an interest to politics and all these different geopolitical connections, maybe for the first time in their life, starting a new family or starting a new career. And I think it's great that you go into depth with your explanations, because then we can all start at a certain point and we can grow together. And again, we want to say thank you again, Dr. Jack Rasmus. This great episode 72. I can't wait to listen to it again tonight. It will air at 6:30 Eastern time, 6:30 p.m. Eastern. I guess it will be 3:30 your time and 5:30 my time, Central, located here in Nashville, Tennessee. Beautiful people.
By the way, if I could just add one more point here, if you want, if your audience wants to read in more detail what I've been talking about, my book, which you just read, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, subtitled Economic Policies From Reagan to Trump, right, is available through my blog, jackrasmus.com. You can go buy it on PayPal. It'll take you to my website. You can buy it on PayPal, or you can buy it on Amazon, whatever, right? That'll give you a good foundation for some of the things I talked about. But as you said, it ended in 2020, and we have 3 more years. You need to read some of my posted articles on my blog to get the update to a lot of this, or follow me on Twitter or my radio show. That will give you the update. But the book itself, Scourge of Neoliberalism, is a good place to start.
It absolutely is. And Dr. Rasmus has published a lot of books over the years, and we're going to link all the information into the episode description so my audience can have a chance to look into more detail into your writings and your thought processes. But beautiful people, enjoy the rest of your day, and we will talk soon. Cheers.